Hey, what's going on, guys? We are live at the Hooked Up Wisconsin studios here, and we're going to be doing some discussion on um, just some walleye fishing with set lines. It's kind of what we're going with. I see my color's kind of weird on the YouTube channel, but that's all right. We're going live on Instagram and YouTube tonight, so we will be discussing all kinds of walleye set lines is kind of the topic here. So if you're in the chat, feel free to ask questions. Basically, want to hear from you guys on what your experience has been with set lines as well. But I'm kind of going to go over some of the ways I fish with walleye set lines and tip ups and that kind of thing tonight. So how's everybody doing? Where are you coming in from? Let me know where you're at, and if you've got walleyes in your area. If you've been catching any lately, would be awesome to know too. I'll give you a little quick report here before I get into it. But right now, we finally have good ice on most of our walleye lakes, and I have not been out really on any walleye water except for once, and it was pretty slow that night. But we're definitely going to be hitting a lot more walleye stuff here shortly. So over the holiday weekend here, I imagine. And it should be pretty good fishing. So these walleyes haven't been molested for a while. So we got plenty of opportunities coming up here. And we got good ice. We got like 10 to 12 inches in a lot of places now. And then like 6 to 8 on some of the bigger lakes. So people will be getting out on machines here pretty soon too. Lots of walleyes and big spirit. Nice. That sounds like a good area. Never been there, but of course we're coming in from northwest Wisconsin, which is kind of not necessarily known for walleye fishing, but we do have walleyes, and they're pretty tough to catch a lot of times up here. They're pretty finicky, and set lines are a good way to catch them up here because we've got a lot of just really, really clear lakes, and a lot of times the walleyes are super spooky. So even walking around and setting, a shack up and everything can really spook them out of the area. So sometimes the best way to catch them is just put tip ups out there and wait for those fish to move in and not make a lot of noise above them on the ice. And that can really, really help kind of keep the walleyes around. And sometimes we're fishing really shallow too. Like a lot of our walleyes in the evening will come really shallow, like even under 6-7 feet. And if you've got a shack up there with lights on and you're moving around a lot and stuff, they're just not going to come in there. So that's why we fish with set lines quite a bit. John says, great in the Hayward area, jigged a few nights this week, not much action, 3 inches on round and the other clear lakes. Okay, so Hayward area, it sounds like they don't have quite as much ice yet, but enough to fish at least, so that's good. Yeah, so jigging's been slow for me too, but again, that's kind of why I was mentioning the set lines. So when I'm fishing walleyes with set lines, especially early, well, throughout the whole season, but especially early, a lot of times I'm looking for green weeds, and that's where I'm going to set up. So my favorite walleye bite in the wintertime is a weed line bite. And a lot of times it's going to be like a really defined weed edge, and the walleyes are going to travel that weed edge kind of looking for food coming in and out of the weeds. And that's a perfect place to set up some set lines. They're kind of concentrated on the edge of the weeds, so it's a really good place to set up and know the walleyes are probably going to see your bait on the edge of those weeds. So that's one of the reasons I like that particular bite, and it's fairly shallow too. So I like to catch walleye shallow when I can catch them shallow. A lot of times they're a little bit bigger. Oftentimes, in my experience, the walleyes that you catch up shallower. So anyway, basically how I'm going to set up on those walleyes on that weed line is I'm going to drop a camera down during daylight. We always want to set up during daylight before evening if we can, or if I'm fishing in the morning, I'm going to set up in the dark. But the evening bite, I'm going to drop a camera and actually find find the edge, and then I'm going to set my set lines about 3 to 4 feet from the edge of those weeds if I can. And that's mainly so my minnow doesn't swim into those weeds and get hung up, and I can have it, fairly close to the bottom. But it's also typically where those walleyes are going to swim is right on the edge of those weeds, and they'll see that bait out away from the weeds a little bit, and it's kind of exposed there. They can see it easier too. So that's a great place to start. But sometimes the walleyes are also not, they're going to be buried in there. And a lot of times they'll just bury in the weeds all day, and then they get up out of the weeds and start feeding towards evening, and they'll never even come near the weed line. They'll just be in, especially in those deeper weed flats and stuff like that, where they've got pockets of weeds that they can hang in. They won't actually sit on the edge. They'll sit in the weeds. And we've caught a lot of them doing that, just dropping a camera till you find a hole in the weeds and dropping a minnow in there up in even 5 or 6 feet of water sometimes, and keeping it like 3 feet off the bottom so it doesn't get swim into the weeds. And that's almost always an after dark kind of thing. Like they'll usually start moving around a little bit before dark. You might get one right after sunset, but a lot of times it's after dark when you get those big ones that live in the weeds kind of moving around and feeding, because all those panfish in the weeds are a prime food source around here. Like we don't have a lot of lakes with pelagic food, so they're going to be the main forage base is going to be hiding in those weeds a lot of times. So that's kind of what we see often is the biggest fish in the lake are just hiding in those weeds like a pike basically and coming out at dark. So as far as what to use for bait, there's a lot of different ways I've fished these fish, but it depends on the lake. It seems like lake to lake, they change what they want and size of the bait that they want. It's like in some lakes I'm fishing, especially super shallow, they won't touch a small minnow. They just want something really big. So I'll use a big sucker, like 7-8 inch sucker, big fat shiners, like hand picked, the biggest ones I can find. And if you drop like a 3-inch shiner on a tip up, or any kind of set line like a predator tip up, they're probably not going to hit it. For whatever reason, they're looking for big baits. Other lakes, it seems like a fathead's the best. Just a fathead on a really light leader, and for whatever reason, those walleyes are targeting smaller bait fish. So you just kind of have to experiment lake to lake and see what they're eating. As far as leaders go, leaders are going to be kind of preference, but it depends on how many pike are in the area and whether I'm fishing during daylight or not. If I'm fishing an area with lots of pike too, and there's I'm fishing during the day, I'll probably run like 20-pound leaders. You might not get as many walleye bites, but at least you're not going to get bit off as much. It's kind of my all-around multi-species rig. But if I'm just fishing walleyes in the weeds or on the weed line, I'm typically going to go 10-pound fluorocarbon on my leaders. In really clear water, I might go as light as 6 or 8. But the problem is when you start getting in those weeds, you're going to have problems with fish getting tangled up in the weeds and breaking off. So that's kind of an issue I've had with going light. You get more bites, but you just can't wrench those fish out of the weeds very well on a lighter leader. So that's kind of my weed line setup. Any of you guys have any particular way you like to fish set lines in your area? I know a lot of guys on the Great Lakes, it's completely different. Mille Lacs, it's different. Some of those Canadian lakes, like Lake of the Woods, etc., it's a little bit different setup too. And here in Wisconsin, we can use 3 lines, so it's really nice that way. We can set up in a shack and jig with a dead stick and still have another line out there, or just jig and have 2 lines out per person. So you get a couple people and you can really cover a weed line or a flat or a point pretty well. And that's one bonus here in Wisconsin is we get a few more lines. So, but yeah, as far as like in my experience on, say, Lake of the Woods, or some of those lakes that you're fishing deeper flats and you're not really fishing weeds as much, it seems to me like the fish are willing to come up off the bottom a lot more. So I'll start putting baits up a little bit higher, oftentimes on those deeper flats, because those fish can see that bait up off the bottom quite a ways, and they can see it further the further off the bottom it is. So you can attract fish from a little bit further distance, I feel like, if you raise that bait up like 3 to 5 feet off the bottom. And walleyes have no problem coming up that far to eat a bait. So weed lines and weeds all day with set lines in Wisconsin. Yeah, that's kind of a classic Wisconsin bite. That weed line bite is definitely where it's at a lot of times here in Wisconsin. But yeah, also on lakes like that don't have a lot of weeds, that are shallower, kind of more darker stained lakes, I'm actually going to keep my bait really close to bottom, because the water clarity is going to become an issue. And I know those walleyes really hang tight to bottom in darker water, muddier water, stained water. So they're going to have a lot harder time seeing a bait that's up high off the bottom. So in like flowages and stuff, I'll usually put it, where there's not much for weeds, I'll usually put that bait within probably 12 inches of the bottom. And I've had much more luck with walleyes doing it that way in some of those more stained waters. And of course, in super clear water, there's almost always weeds up here anyway. But you can also run into rock, and rock can be really good in the wintertime, especially a rock to sand transition. And there I'm going to put it, my bait up a couple feet off the bottom typically. And a lot of times those lakes are going to be super clear. And if there's no weeds around, I am going to use lighter line in those conditions, because there's nothing around that bait for the fish to see that's going to break up the outline of your line. So long leaders and light leaders are going to be key in those, in kind of those more rock mud transitions in clear lakes. That's where I really kind of downsize on my line. And as far as what I'm using for set lines, I still do use some tip ups, your classic tip up style, especially if it's really, really cold. If it's below zero, especially, I'll put a tip up out there just because the spool's below the water. But most of the time, obviously, I am using the Predator tip ups if I can, if weather permits. I really like fighting fish on a rod and reel, and I enjoy just that whole setup. It's a fun way to catch them versus hand lining, and you lose less fish on a rod and reel too, because that rod's doing the shock absorption. So how long of a leader would I go? I would say on average probably about 6 feet on my tip ups, with tip up line, something like that. On it depends on what I'm using on my rods for the Predator tip up, but I'll usually go about a 3-foot leader to braid. If I'm using, kind of that Predator tip up for whatever I'm fishing for. If I'm not using braid, sometimes I'll just run straight 8-pound mono and just fish it straight. Especially if I'm doing like an auto hook set style on the Predator, then I'll just run 8-pound mono, because that mono holds the fish better once the rod snaps. And that's something I should talk about too. With the Predator tip up for walleyes, I'm gonna sometimes set up for finicky walleyes with that set up in auto mode. And I'm going to use smaller minnows, so fatheads, and I'm going to use a size 4 octopus hook, really light line, and I'm going to set that in auto. So as soon as that walleye sucks that minnow in, it's going to set the hook on them. And anyone who's set line fished for walleyes much at all, you've probably had those nights where you had flag after flag after flag on your tip ups and they drop it. They just won't hold on to it, right? Well, that's one of those times when you want to set your Predator tip up in auto mode if you can. If you're in Wisconsin and it's legal, you want to just absolutely set that on a light trigger with that fathead. If that walleye touches that bait, gets it in his mouth and pulls just a little bit of line, he's going to be hooked. He doesn't have time to drop that bait. And I've caught a lot of walleyes on nights where I would not have caught many at all using that auto setting. It's pretty slick. You only use octopus hooks for set lines? No, I don't. If I'm using bigger minnows, I almost always use trebles. The reason I use octopus hooks typically on auto set is just because I have had better hookup ratios, and I'm oftentimes using smaller minnows, and I don't like to have a heavy hook holding that minnow down. I want it to kind of swim around freely, and a treble hook just weighs them down a little bit more. And if I hook that minnow parallel to the body and then back out, so the point is pointing towards the tail, when the fish eats the minnow, it just hooks him in the top of the mouth almost every time with that octopus hook. So that's kind of my auto set setup. Otherwise, most of the time I'm using treble hooks. I have done a little experimenting with circle hooks, and those work as well, especially if you want to be careful about hooking those fish deep. But usually if I don't want to hook the fish deep, I just set it in auto mode and hook them right away. Now, if I'm using heavier rods and bigger baits on auto set, I'm still going to use trebles, but I'm going to use like a light quick strike rig typically on those, and some smaller treble hooks with like some maybe 10 or 15 pound line tied in a tandem quick strike rig, so that when they hit it, one of those hooks is going to be in their mouth. So that's kind of my strategy for the auto setting. But, you know, walleyes, oftentimes, if you give them a bait and they don't feel any tension, they'll swim away with it and they'll eat it. And you can use flag mode for walleyes a lot too. That works really well. Excuse me. And as far as options for flag mode, the best one I found is actually a bait cast reel and set in as a free spool, but with a little bit of magnetic casting drag set on it, because the fish won't spool the line then if they take a quick run. But they really, if it's warm enough out and you can run braid on that setup, if it's above freezing, 100% the best, because they can't feel that spool. It's so smooth with that bait caster. They can take line all day long and they're not going to feel anything. You go to more of the spinning reel style with the bait feeder. It's a lot more tension that they have to pull on a bait feeder, and walleyes can be real finicky, as you all know. So a bait feeder is just not quite ideal. But if it's freezing and it's cold, you almost have to use one, or if it's real windy. But I'm experimenting with some new braid. I'm trying the fins braid. Supposedly the ice tamer is really good. If I can use braid on a bait caster in colder weather, I'm definitely gonna do it. So I'm really hopeful that stuff's gonna do well in the cold. But that's such an awesome way to do it with that bait cast. It's pretty hard to beat. Pretty hard to beat. Now, the other option is, if it's not windy, you can usually set up a spinning rod with just a free spool, because the wind's not going to blow the line off the spool. But you have much wind, and the line is going to want to blow off the spool. So you got to be careful with that with spinning rods and free spool, or I should say. They do work, and I have used them, but just not in the wind. And then, of course, in auto mode, you're just going to set your drag and close the bail, and that rod is going to hook the fish and fight it for you. So, and that's kind of my rundown, I guess, of how I typically fish walleyes with tip ups. Now, let's hear what you guys have to say. Suckers versus shiners versus fatheads. What's your favorite minnow for a set line setup? I know some guys are diehard sucker fans. Some guys are never buy anything but shiners. Some guys strictly run fatheads, but I use all three. Some people have a secret bait. So let me know what you guys are using on your walleye set lines. I've never caught a walleye on dead bait. That's kind of a pike thing. I've definitely caught a lot of pike on dead bait, but Walleyes seem to want it moving around. That's just how walleyes seem to be. They want to see that bait alive. They're not much of a scavenger, so to speak. So what are you guys' favorite? What's your favorite minnow to use on a set line? I know some guys in Minnesota get those rainbows. Some guys get chubs. We don't usually see those around here. They're not available too often. We're pretty much just stuck to suckers and shiners and fatheads. But Micah says, have I ever fished for Lakers on the ice? Yes, they're my absolute favorite fish to catch through the ice, actually. They're aggressive, they're fast, and they're a blast to catch, good to eat. All the above. They're the ultimate ice fishing fish, in my opinion. Around me, lots of rivers connect to the lakes, so suckers and shiners both work. Nice. Doubled up multiple times on both. That's awesome. Yeah, they're both good. I mean, I probably have caught probably the same amount of walleyes on both suckers and shiners. Some nights it does seem to matter which one you're using, and I'll end up switching to one or the other. But other nights I've caught an equal amount on both. They're just both very effective walleye baits. Typically, the one thing you do have to pay attention to with your suckers and shiners is not necessarily the look of them, but the way that they act. So shiners, oftentimes you get weight below them, like a split shot, they're going to want to swim up and away from the weight. That's kind of their natural tendency, is to swim up and away. Suckers almost always swim for the bottom. That's where they live. And if you ever look in a river, the suckers are always on the bottom. So they'll try and swim down, and that's where they're trying to get to. Shiners are much more open water, pelagic type fish, so they're going to swim up and away and try and get away from that weight or whatever you've got on the line. So that's one thing you got to pay attention to. That's one thing I've noticed, that sometimes walleyes prefer that bait trying to swim up and away from them. Sometimes they prefer it trying to swim down. So like on those days when you're catching walleyes on spoons, pounding them on the bottom, that's probably when you want to use a sucker. If you're making those fish chase it up when you're jigging, you probably want to use a shiner, because that's going to do the same thing. It's going to swim up and away from them. That's something a lot of people don't catch, is the way that they swim. Weldon says, suckers and fatheads. I've had decent luck on the predator setting for crappies with fatheads and catching walleyes. Yep, for sure. Kind of go by time of day. Early and afternoons, suckers, high sun, fatheads. There you go. That's a good tip. A little bit more finessey presentation in the daytime. Golden shiners, when you could get them from Al at Pastica's. Yeah, the golden shiners are pretty sweet bait, but they're pretty rare too anymore. Once in a while, you'll find one kind of mixed in with your regular shiners, and I've actually caught them too. I've caught them jigging for panfish in some lakes, and I've put them on a tip up and caught fish on those golden shiners. Sometimes they get big enough that you can actually catch them and put them back down there. Which is legal, by the way. If you use them on the same body of water you caught them on and don't bring them away from the lake, you can use them. Now, in Wisconsin, that brings up another point. We can use panfish and or game fish for bait legally, as long as they're legal size. So panfish, you can use any size. Technically, you could use any size bass too in some of the counties, because there's no size limit. You could use a small pike. There's no size limit on those. And actually, I have caught plenty of walleyes on live bluegills on tip-ups before. I mean, that's their natural food source. If you can catch a bunch of little, 3-inch bluegills or 4-inch bluegills, I don't mind throwing those in the bucket and putting them down there and seeing what happens. And I've caught them on live perch before. Caught them on live crappies before. I can't say I've caught them on bass or pike before, but definitely panfish. And believe it or not, we caught a walleye one time. We deep hooked it. It was a nice fish. It was like a 26-inch walleye. And we cleaned it, and it had a 10-inch northern pike in its stomach. So that just goes to tell you how big of a bait a walleye will eat if it can catch it. So, that wasn't even a huge walleye. It was maybe a 6-pounder, and it ate a 10-inch pike, no problem. So, some of those minnows you get, they don't even look at them because they're targeting those big baits like that walleye probably was, and we caught that on a probably 7 or 8-inch sucker, so it was still looking for a big meal even after it ate that pike. So definitely, in some places you almost can't go too big with your bait. And I feel like sometimes too, if you can get a walleye to eat a bigger bait, they're not as likely to drop it a lot of times because the bait's struggling. They're expecting it to struggle, and they don't really notice that the line is part of the equation. Whereas when they eat a small minnow, they're not expecting tension. They're not expecting it to fight back that much. So they start pulling on that line and feel it, and they drop it. But if you can get them to take a big minnow, oftentimes they just won't let it go, which is kind of handy too. In my neck of the woods, what is my hookup on hard baits to set lines? Just curious. Some parts of the state we do a lot on rods. Lots of lakes we fish are negative towards a spoon or tikka. Well, I'll tell you what. I had years ago. I did not have much luck on any kind of jigging baits. We never grew up fishing them, so I started out set line fishing. I mean, when we went walleye fishing, we didn't even own walleye jigs when I was a kid. We put our tip ups out and waited. That's all we ever did. So, I'm fairly new to jigging, really. Maybe 10 years or so, 10 or 15 years I've been using hard baits, but I've been doing more and more of that and catching more walleyes on them. But like I was mentioning earlier, you got to really know when to use them. The biggest problem for me is the places I'm fishing, the walleyes oftentimes are really shallow and they're spooky. So to try and sit there and make no noise long enough for a walleye to move in while you're jigging takes a lot of patience, because you're going to set up a shack or whatever, or walk to a hole, make a bunch of noise. Any walleyes in that area are gone. You're in 6, 7, 8 feet of water. Those walleyes are out of there. So then you just have to wait, sit it out, and wait for them to move back in, and that can take quite a while. So, when I'm jigging, I'm typically trying to jig in a little bit deeper water than my set lines are for walleyes. And then the other thing I'll do is, if I know I'm on a really, really good spot, I'll just drill everything out, set everything up way, way ahead of time, and then I just won't move. I'll just set my shack up and leave it, keep the lights dim, and make little movements, no talking, like just try and be really, really quiet. And sometimes those walleyes will move in. That's how I got that walleye to bite on camera last year. If you guys have seen that video, where I had 2 different ones come in on the camera, right, in kind of evening twilight, and I got them to hit right in the shack. And that was only in like 8 feet of water, but I was being really quiet, and I was just sitting it out, waiting for them to move in. So, and we had a lot of ice and snow at that point. That was late in the year, so it made it a lot easier. This thin ice early, it's really hard to catch them shallow, unless you've got set lines just away from the action. So that's been my experience. But man, when you can get on a good jigging bite, it's pretty dang fun. It's a lot more fun, in my opinion, than anything else. Catching walleyes on spoons or horizontal baits is pretty dang hard to beat, for sure. But there is something about seeing that flag up too that gets a guy's heart rate going. So, but I guess to answer your question, ratio wise, I'm probably getting closer to 50-50 now, but I probably still do catch more walleyes on set lines by a little bit. Good question, though. Anyone else have any questions on set lines, walleye fishing, what's going on in the area, ice reports? Let me know. I didn't realize I had quite so much to say about set lines, but every time I start talking about fishing, I end up talking forever. Yeah, the flag will never get old, right? that's something we all can kind of relate to as ice fishermen, is watching that flag pop up. That's one of the reasons that we were so adamant that the Predator tip-up had to have a flag on it that would work in auto mode, because that was just something we missed when we were fishing with like jaw jackers or automatic fishermen. There was no flag, and it's like it's just not the same without a flag. So we made sure that the Predator tip-up worked with the flag, and that's one of the unique things about it, is it works in flag mode or in auto mode. What tip-up lights do I run? Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even cover that. So I'm a big fan of Vulture systems. I run Vulture systems radio indicators on all my tip-ups, and I use the old school ones most of the time. I do have some of the new Revos, but I haven't quite gotten into those as much yet. I still like the old school original Vultures. They're kind of that disc, and it's got the magnet that clips into the top, and I just run a little line with an alligator clip to whatever flag I've got. And that's another reason the flag is really handy on the Predator tip up in auto mode. You can attach that any kind of light or indicator to it. But I like to know when my tip ups go off. So that kind of, it also has a light, so it definitely lights up, but I can know which one it is. The second it goes up, that thing's going to start beeping, and I know I've got a bite. And I don't have to watch out my window, in my shack or whatever. I can just leave them sit, and I get the beep. I know I've got a bite. So I'm a plumber. So oftentimes if I'm working on a lake, like working at a house on a lake, I'll just go set tip-ups with Vultures on them, and I'll just hang my little remote up where I'm working, and I don't even have to watch them. I can work and work and work until I get a flag and I get a beep and go catch a fish. That's one of the beauties of being a self-employed. You get to do whatever you want. The boss can't tell you you can't fish on the job. But yeah, good question. I've also used the blue tips, and they work as well. I really prefer the radio signal of the Vulture. For one of the reasons I like the Vultures, it's got a 2-mile signal radius, and I in Wisconsin we don't have a distance requirement. I think in Minnesota it's 200 yards, but here in Wisconsin there's no limit to how far your lines can be, as long as you're actively watching those lines and tending them. So I can put tip-ups on 2 different structures a half mile apart if I want, and I can monitor those lines. So that's one nice thing about the Vultures. The signal distance is a lot better than anything that's just Bluetooth only. So that's what I'm using. They're pretty awesome. And they're foolproof too. That's the other thing. I just haven't had them fail on me. Like Bluetooth is somewhat unreliable. The other reason I got them is I film with my phone most of the time. When I'm filming videos, I'm using my iPhone. So if I'm using Bluetooth, that really messes with everything when I'm getting signals coming through my phone when I'm trying to film. It doesn't really work. So the Vulture is perfect for that, because it has a phone app and you can use it, but you don't have to. You can just only use the remote, and you can send the remote Bluetooth to your phone if you want, but I just never wanted to do that since I'm filming with it. So yeah, that was a great question. Any other questions on set lines, or how to use them, when to use them, where to use them, anything like that? Thanks for joining, everybody, too, by the way. I'm gonna try and keep these lives going every Thursday night at 9:00, and we'll have a kind of a different topic every night, and I'll try and do a little bit of an ice report for the area too, and we'll just talk fishing. But I also like any ideas from you guys too on topics. So if you have a topic you want to discuss some night, let me know. Alan Smith says, "What is ice?" Non-related question on set lines, but what area of Wisconsin? I am in northwest Wisconsin in the Spooner Hayward area. Are fiberglass graphite mixed rods okay for the clam predator tip ups? If you're using them in auto mode and leaving them bent, I think the hybrid rods are probably fine. Do not use a straight graphite rod though in a bent position in an auto, because it will snap in the cold. If you leave it there, you can leave it there 2 hours sometimes, and all of a sudden it'll just explode. I've seen it happen. Have you been up to Lake Superior yet? No, there's some ice in a couple areas, but it's still really sketchy. I heard the ice that was there is only like 3-4 inches right now, and it's actually broke up today, started cracking up. So we're not quite there yet. Typically, that's going to be more around early to mid-January by the time you really can safely fish much up there. We've been on there in late December around Christmas before, but it's got to be pretty cold and calm to get that froze over by then. Grew up in Somerset. Spent some time up here. Nice. Oh, yeah. 100%. It is a great place if you love to fish, because there's basically water everywhere you go. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lakes within 30 miles of my house. So, and most of them have fish in them, which is pretty sweet. Alan Smith's in Minnesota. Well, you know what ice is if you're in Minnesota. That's like the ice fishing state. What's your preference for hooks on tip-ups? Treble or single? How much does color matter? I was just fishing Chippewa flowage and got bites on tip-ups that had small hooks, but also lost fish. Well, we kind of covered hooks a little bit earlier, but I'll go over it again. I really do prefer treble hooks for most of what I'm doing, but I'll go smaller than most people will on my trebles. I'm using pretty small ones for walleyes. You just don't need a lot of gap for most minnows we're using. Now, really, trebles should be matched to the size bait you're using. If you're using a bigger minnow, go with a bigger treble. Smaller minnow, smaller treble. And then, on my predator tip ups in auto mode, I'm usually using a single octopus hook, like a 6 or a 4, for those small shiners and fatheads. And it's just kind of depends on the size bait you're using, really. But they both work. Singles work, trebles work. Whatever you have confidence in, I would go with that. But hook color, I messed around with it a little bit. I've used some red trebles, some silver trebles. I really like the monochromatic kind of rainbow trebles from Clam. They're pretty sweet looking, and I feel like it gives the fish something different that they haven't seen before. And they're kind of like that motor oil slick looking, color changing coating on them. I've been using those quite a bit, and they've been working good. So does it really matter on a hook? Probably not that much, but it's fun to mess around with the color anyway, even if it doesn't matter. So I know a lot of guys who swear by red, and you can't really go wrong with a red hook. I don't think. It's pretty hard to beat. If I had to pick one, it would probably be just plain, nickel coated, a little bit of shine to it. That's, probably your safest bet. But it's fun to mess around and try new stuff for sure. Got bites on tip-ups that had small hooks, but also lost fish, he said too. Yeah, so one thing you have to be careful of on tip-ups is if you're using small hooks and heavy leaders and you've got that Dacron line and you're hand lining, there's a lot of tension that happens when that fish head shakes because there's no stretch. So you really do have to put a longer mono leader on there if you're going to use small hooks to kind of absorb the shock of those head shakes. And because you don't have a rod that's doing that, you can get away with a lot smaller hooks if you're using a rod and reel. So another reason I go with the predator tip up a lot of times is so that I can get away with lighter tackle and still land fish, versus going with a hand line where I've got to beef up my tackle to land those fish. I've seen guys that are pretty dang good at controlling the line because they've done it 1,000 times on tip-ups, but not everybody has that kind of finesse. Do spinners and beads make a difference? Well, here's my personal opinion on spinners and beads. I don't want anything attached to my bait that's not natural. If I didn't have to fish with a hook in the bait, I wouldn't. Anything around that bait that moves with the bait doesn't look real, in my opinion, and is not going to help you. I know in Minnesota for a long time you had to have some kind of spinner or something if you were going to use a treble hook. That is no longer the case. They got rid of that ruling, so you can use a plain treble hook now with a live bait in Minnesota. And I do not think that they help. I think of it like, what if you got a weed hooked on your line and that was kind of moving weird with your fish or with your bait? That wouldn't look normal to a fish. Neither does anything else attached to the line, in my opinion. Maybe a little flicker spinner I'll use at times. I'll use those little VMC hooks with the spinners on them, just for a little extra flash. Or I have used some glow beads if I want to fish at night and want a little glow to it. I'll put one right next to the hook or on the hook. But other than that, I don't mess with them. I think it just doesn't help at all. And if anything, I think it hurts. Yeah, a little willow blade maybe. Yeah, I mean, a blade is made to spin, so you're not going to get any spin out of it on a rig. So you might get a little flicker from it moving back and forth. Excuse me, but spinner blades are designed to be pulled through the water. Like on, for instance, a crawler harness when you're fishing walleyes, that blade is moving, so it's spinning all the time on the leader, right? Then it has attracting properties. It's got vibration, it's got flash, it does all the things. But if it's just sitting there on the line, it just doesn't do anything that is going to attract the fish, in my opinion. Just not designed for a still application, That's my personal opinion. So you can take it with a grain of salt or whatever you want to do, but that's been my experience. The less stuff on your line, the more bites you're going to get. The thinner the line, the lighter the hook, the less stuff around that bait, just so it looks natural, the better off you are. Now that brings me to weight too, because I didn't really talk about weight on a set line, but I do typically go with like a small BB size split shot on most of my set lines, and it's not really necessarily just to keep my bait from moving and swimming away into the weeds, but it's also because I don't want to dink around waiting for my minnow to go down forever when I set that bait up. Like if you don't have a weight on it, the minnow's just going to swim sideways, and it takes forever to get your line down. I kind of want to get it down there and get a weight down there. Now on my autos, I'll use a lot of weight because it doesn't matter. When the fish comes up, eats that bait, starts swimming away, it's not going to feel anything until that hooks get set. So on my autos, I'll use as much weight as I want, and it doesn't really matter. Now when you're not using auto and you're letting them run, you don't want too much weight on there because they'll feel it. It'll get snagged in the weeds. It'll drag on the bottom, and they'll drop it. But I like to fish with like a BB size split shot just to get my bait down there and hold it down there, and but not be so much weight that the fish are going to feel it. Now I know some guys that swear they don't never use weights. They don't use them. They just let that minnow go. But that's not me. I like to use a little bit of weight. So again, that's just my personal preference, but it works for me. So any other questions or thoughts on walleye fishing with set lines? That's kind of been our discussion here. If you've just joined, and I'm probably going to wrap this up in a little bit here, probably a few more minutes to answer a couple more questions if you want to get any in. And then I'm going to ask you guys one more question too before we go. Do any of you have any kind of video that you would like to see me film? Any kind of how-to, any kind of you name it, any kind of tutorial, any place, any location you'd want to see some stuff on the YouTube channel. I would love to know if you've got any suggestions. I've got about 100 video ideas in a list already, but I'm always looking for better ideas. So let me know if you have any. That would be super cool. Laser Beam says, hey, how's it going? Four inches of ice north of Race Lake. Looks warm next week. Yeah, it does look warm next week, but I think the snow is really going to help to kind of keep things insulated so we don't lose too much ice. Pothole lakes for trout. That would be cool, but I'm not going to film it. I've got a couple buddies who fish those pothole lakes, and I've pretty much sworn that I'm not going to film on those lakes for my channel, which is why you haven't seen anything about me fishing trout on pothole lakes. So that's a great idea, and it would be cool, but there's just certain things I'm not willing to put out there on YouTube, and that's one of them. But good idea. Would a treble the size of a stinger hook be way too small for a tip up with a crappie minnow? No, it would not. You can't go too small almost with a crappie minnow. Like you could use a number 16 treble and probably work. Would love to see a video on how to target walleye in shallow water and how to find weeds. Good. That's good. I'm actually planning on doing one just pretty much just like that. So I'm in the Eau Claire area, like getting up your way, some really good little gem lakes. Yes, there's a lot of little lakes up here that are out of the way, don't get a lot of pressure, and they're fun to explore. You never know what you're going to find on some of those little lakes, especially for panfish. There's a lot of little panfish potholes up here that you can catch some dandy crappies and bluegills on. Video on how to turn on crappie when they're finicky and calling them in. That's a good one. There's a lake I fished where they are very finicky, and I could definitely do a video on that. Because it is I can take people there who aren't very experienced with crappies that are in that mood, and it's brutal. I mean, they just can't catch them. I'll be catching them, but they can't catch them. If you don't have a flasher, you might as well not even fish there because you will not catch them. They're just not. You have to work them and work them and work them, and everything has to be perfect. So that would be an interesting one. I like that idea. I like that idea. I just did a video actually on kind of when to use calling baits versus light baits for crappies. So you might want to go watch that one because I did kind of cover that subject. Got one on Southwest Wisconsin, and one day it's hot and the next they're ghosts. Yeah, that can certainly happen. Come to St. Croix and film a sturgeon catch. That's actually on my list too. So I'm definitely interested in that. Seems like that's getting a lot more popular lately, and I love sturgeon personally, so I would love to do a sturgeon video, but I'm sure it's challenging. I'm guessing it would probably take a couple days unless I got really lucky to film something like that, so it's a little bit time consuming to do one, but I think that would be a fun one. I think people would like that, so I'm definitely considering it. Yeah, good ideas. Good ideas. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for joining, and I appreciate all the comments as usual and the ideas for videos, and I'll try and get to them. It's been a tough week. My kids have been sick. We've all been kind of taking turns home from work, trying to just keep things going around here. So I haven't been out much this week, but after Christmas, I'm hoping that things are going to open up for me, and I'm going to get out there a little bit more and do some filming. So thanks again, guys, and I appreciate all of you, and have a good night. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. I won't see you till after Christmas, so Merry Christmas, everybody. Talk to you later.